started. This is the 185th Security Thought Leadership webinar. And as those of you who join us regularly will know, the idea of thought leadership is to critique today what is going on so we get a better type of response in the future. And the topic today is crime against wildlife. What's being done and is it working? And is normal with us? We have three experts, three panelists, and each are coming at this from a different direction. So what I'll do is I'll start off by inviting each of them to introduce themselves, and as is normal, I'll then come back to them all and give them 3 minutes to say whatever they want to say about the topic. Don't forget, question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to ask a question, do get it in early. Some of you have sent questions in advance, so I'll try and incorporate those too. Without further ado then, let's go over to meet Melanie. Melanie, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, thanks, Martin. Yeah, Melanie Flynn. I'm a senior lecturer in criminology and policing at the University of Huddersfield and the Deputy Director of the Applied Criminology and Policing Research Centre. And I have previously worked as both a volunteer police officer and a crime analyst as well.
Well, Melanie, I didn't know that latter bit, you know. All that time I've known about you, I didn't know that. Thank you, Melanie. And now we go across the pond to Will. Will, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Will Moretto. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Central Florida. I primarily research wildlife crime as well as other related crimes that involve or can impact wildlife crime, as well as looking at conservation rangers as well too. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. What many people might not know, because they're not familiar with academia, is Melanie and Will at the forefront of research in this subject around the world. So I'm delighted to have them here. And our final panelist, not an academic, but one of the most famous in the world of policing in the United Kingdom, it's Georgie. Georgie, welcome. Please introduce yourself to those who don't know you.
Thank you, Martin. Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. Very excited to be here. My name is Georgie Barnard. I'm the Chief Executive of the West End Security Group based here in London. I spent 31 years as a police officer, working as a local officer and then covering the whole of London and then running what is now called the National Business Crime Centre, covering a whole wide range of crime. I also work for the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons as one of their investigators.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, three different panelists with different views. Let's hear what they've got to say about this subject. 3 minutes when they get to say whatever they want to say about this topic. So let's first of all go back to Melanie. Melanie, can we have your opening thoughts, please?
Yeah, so as is sort of apparent from both my research and my previous experience in policing as well, brings together two real key areas for me. One is my research on policing and one is my research on green criminology, particularly animal harm. So I'm particularly focused on wildlife crime as a problem of harm to animals, both wildlife and domestic animals as well, that I'm interested in. So to that extent, the areas that I particularly am keen to talk about relate to the harms of wildlife crime and therefore the necessity of taking it more seriously, and then also the policing and prevention of wildlife crime. So I've done sort of work looking at some of the problems that are faced by enforcers in relation to wildlife crime. And although I was mainly focusing on the UK, this also could relate to many sort of international jurisdictions as well. So I highlighted concerns around corruption and the role of corruption in preventing effective enforcement against wildlife, the lack of resources dedicated to tackling problems of crime against wildlife, a lack of awareness, which hopefully sort of things like today help tackle some of that, but a lack of awareness both in terms of amongst enforcers, the judiciary, prosecutors, etc., but also amongst consumers of products that come from illicit wildlife trade. That broadly it's not taken seriously enough, and therefore that all of these things together make it very difficult for us to achieve effective deterrence against wildlife. So we try to tackle wildlife crime on that kind of typical deterrence model of let's catch people and punish them and then that will deter offending. And I think that there are some real difficulties of doing that need to be tackled within enforcement and sentencing. And then I also think we need to do a lot more work, which I know probably will also talk about in relation to sort of crime prevention activity, particularly opportunity reduction, situational, environmental based crime prevention activity, which is sensitively applied in a sort of taking into account sort of community needs as well. So it's not just sort of a very blunt tool to try and tackle the problem, because it's a very complex problem, both at the consumer and demand end.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Melanie. I mean, so many questions come out of that. Let's without further ado hear what Will's got to say. Will, you're also a researcher. Where are you coming at this from? 3 minutes from you, Will.
Sure. So I'd like maybe to start with highlighting maybe 3 key themes or discussion points that I believe are worth noting as it relates to wildlife crime, its related consequences, and its prevention. The first centers on recognizing that wildlife crime is a fairly broad term, a very legalistic term that encompasses a variety of different illegal activities, including illegal hunting and trafficking. However, to Dr. Flynn's point, wildlife crime conceptually does not fully encompass the detrimental impact that harms against wildlife can incur. For instance, human-wildlife conflict may provoke individuals to engage in retaliatory killings. Moreover, not all wildlife crime is necessarily transnational or involves organized crime, despite ongoing debate and discussion on this topic. This can at times be a fairly running kind of narrative. However, this can also result in the misrepresentation of the problem. Further, this can result in neglecting how other illegal activities may intersect with wildlife crimes, like corruption, as Dr. Flynn mentioned. The second theme or discussion point focuses on the need to understand the criminal justice system, including law enforcement, that on its own will not be sufficient to prevent wildlife crime in many places. Challenges related to sufficient training, personnel, adequate laws hinder the effectiveness of the criminal justice system. Moreover, issues related to corruption, lack of prosecutorial and judicial training, and lack of political will further detriment the impact of criminal justice responses. And as a result, other alternative non-criminal justice responses should be considered, and as Dr. Flynn mentioned, very carefully applied, fully recognizing also there's certain limitations to these responses as well too, when not thought out carefully. The final theme discussion point I would like to highlight is that while wildlife crime tends to focus on more conservation-related and ecological impacts, it is crucial to understand the human dimensions as well. This will assist in better understanding the context for enforcement and prevention, as well as the impact of any type of initiative that is actually implemented. So, for example, if you're understanding the role of enforcers, or in some of the work that I've done, focus on conservation rangers and understanding job stress and job satisfaction, that's important to understand and realize how they're able to actually perform their jobs. Moreover, understanding community relations, community engagement, and compliance is important to understand how individuals are willing to be guardians for locations and areas that they're familiar with. Failure to understand these realities that people face when engaging in and responding to wildlife crime beyond the policies that appear on paper can be detrimental in fully appreciating what can be effective and also what can be problematic. Finally, context and culture matters. Any development and implementation related to enforcement or prevention must recognize, account for, and respect the local context and culture in which such strategies or initiatives are designed, implemented, and evaluated. And I'll end there.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Thank you once again. Lots of good stuff we'll pick up on in a minute. Some of that overlaps what Melanie said. Some of it takes us in a different direction. So some good issues there. Don't forget, if you'd like to ask a question, to use the quick question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. That would be really, really helpful. Thank you. And let's hear from Georgie. Georgie, for a slightly different take, I think. Georgie, over to you.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about policing perspective. And it's interesting that both Will and Melanie have mentioned training, legislation. Wildlife crime is a huge challenge for policing, apart from the fact that it really does vary in the UK, and I suspect around most countries. You know, wildlife crime in an inner city is very different to if you're trying to police out in a rural area where you have lots of farming and a different kind of landscape. I think the biggest thing is, the training for police officers generally is very minimalistic. It was seen when I joined back in the 80s as a very specialised subject. Back in the day, there was a reasonable amount of officers that had that specialism. Nowadays, I think, I wouldn't be unfair to say you're probably lucky to get maybe 1-2 officers in central London that have that specialism, and across the country, no more than a handful. So that indicates how really challenging it is for police officers themselves to understand and to apply the law where it is relevant. That brings us to working with partners. On the plus side, there are some great partners out there, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, the RSPCA that protect animals, trading standards, And I know that policing work really hard with partners to try and bring perpetrators to justice. But again, that that cross-sector approach does make it very, very challenging. I think also there's wider implications for crime, where we see, for instance, in the UK, we have something called hair coursing, where it really can be very disruptive to the land. It also brings other crime alongside it, just because culturally, the kind of people that do hair coursing also bring a different kind of type of crime with them. That can be very, very challenging. And that the legislation itself in places is still very outdated. It's very difficult to understand, and it's very difficult to apply. And again, I think one of the things that Will said is, trying to get this into the minds of our leaders and our politicians to have it revisited or perhaps updated is one of the most challenging things for policing, to make it relevant to 2023 and how do we protect. Having said all that, we are very lucky, particularly in the UK. We love our animals and do not underestimate the power of the public. And I certainly, in my own experiences, where we've had campaigns to protect our wildlife, or where we've seen trends, crime trends, and things do go in trends, where we see, I don't know, for instance, baiting suddenly becomes back in fashion, or egg stealing. We can use the power of the public and social media and media to get behind us to help tackle that. So very, very wide ranging. But yeah, lots to think about there.
Yeah, really important stuff here. And I wonder whether I could, I've just been messaged a question. It was exactly where I was going to go with myself. So let me come to you first, Melanie, if I might. All the panelists are raising the issue of the difficulties with enforcement and the importance of awareness. I think all three of you in different ways have raised that. What is the panel view on what we can do? What's the single most important set of strategies that could be adopted in order to bring about a focus that has a realistic chance of bringing about change? And I guess that's at the high level, the strategic sort of thinking. Melanie, over to you. Okay, it's difficult. Got the point of all the points you raised, but where might we look to bring about some change here? Because it's a global issue. It's a global problem. Is there a global solution in wanting? So I'll come to Melanie, then I'll come to you, Will.
Personally, I don't think there's a global solution. I think that wildlife crime, as has been mentioned by other panelists, is so diverse and plays out, even if the crime is connected across countries because of trade, it plays out in very different ways in those countries, depending upon if it's a range state where the wildlife comes from, or if it's a consumer state where they're wanting to buy it, for example. And obviously that is then very different to locally based wildlife crime. So it might be a bit of a cop-out here, but my answer for this part, unless I think about it a bit more, is I don't think there is probably a global solution, but I think there are key things and key principles that might be useful in multiple countries. One of the things I think is around our research, I have to say, more research, to therefore inform policy and raise awareness, particularly about things such as been mentioned, the overlap between wildlife crime and other types of crime. So I think it's maybe, I'm not sure I particularly want to go down that route, but I think one way to sell it to people as being something to take more concern about is to recognise actually many people who are committing wildlife offences, particularly the sorts of things like hair coursing, like Georgie mentioned, domestic sort of related wildlife crime, are likely committing other types of offence. So we have this principle of self-selecting policing, that people who do little bad things also do big bad things. People don't tend to specialise in terms of their offending. So it's highly likely that there are a range of other offences, either that facilitate the wildlife crime, or that just people are committing those offences anyway because they're prepared to break the laws about wildlife, so why not break the laws about other things? That could be a way of sort of raising the sort of seriousness of how people sort of perceive it. The other thing I think, particularly from an enforcement perspective, is moving towards more evidence-based approaches and sharing of best practice around what works in enforcement and policing, which we've seen for most other types of offence, traditional types of offence. We've got what works toolkits, we've got all of this information. In wildlife crime, what I think we have is small pockets of really excellent practice that nobody else knows about. And there needs to be a lot more effort to try and bring some of that together somehow, perhaps In this country, for example, in the UK, perhaps under organisations like the National Wildlife Crime Unit as a holder of that, what works toolkits around what's being done. I've been to the National Wildlife Enforcers Conference, heard some brilliant things based on situational crime prevention that worked really well, but people that weren't there wouldn't have known anything about it. So there's a constant reinventing of the wheel. But I'll let others speak as well on top of that. Analysis, intelligence-led approaches, that kind of thing, I think.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That was helpful. Will, your thoughts on this, similar to Melanie or different?
Very similar. I think that it's actually very problematic to assume that a broad, general, apply it all to everywhere approach is going to be very problematic, actually. I think that any type of response has to be specifically tailored to the context in which it's applied to. It needs to be designed fully recognizing the political climate, local or otherwise, as well as what's available in terms of resources. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have right now, particularly when it comes to enforcement, is not only having a lack of resources, but having a failure to understand what kind of resources you need. So there tends to, at times, for example, I've done a lot of work in protected areas. There tends to be a very interested focus on certain types of technology. Whether it be through the use of unmanned drones, use through other types of technology that are useful for enforcement, CCTV cameras, and et cetera. And while that can be applied and useful, particularly for certain types of uses, failure to neglect other types of technology, which again, looking at the human component, like, I don't know, getting access to clean water, is a failure to understand really the problem itself, right? So for example, if you're focused on trying to understand how laws are actually implemented, you have to understand the people first and foremost, I think. And that requires a very contextualized kind of assessment. Moreover, I think that to Dr. Flynn's point about evidence-based, I think one of the most important components right now, when it comes to better understanding prevention, enforcement, and so on, is just education. I think education and just awareness is going to be really pivotal when it comes to not only disseminating information to those tasked with enforcement, but then also information for other stakeholders, because again, criminal justice is not going to be the only approach that is going to be useful. And in some cases might actually be counterproductive. So information, education that can be levied at the local level, I think is going to be very beneficial when it comes to this kind of topic.
Yeah, okay, well, thank you very much. It's funny you ended on that point, and I was going to say to Georgie, there is this sort of thought there's not an answer, but you've got one, awareness, and then we'll put it at the end. I remember Ken Pease, who's a very famous criminologist, once said, do not underestimate the power of shared outrage. And Georgie, your thoughts on this topic?
Well, it's interesting that Will should say that, because I think, at the end of the day, policing is led by what the public wants. And I think that it comes in two ways, doesn't it? First of all, we do need to educate. We need to make sure that people understand that we have got endangered species. And I know there are pockets of some excellent work out there that do highlight, for instance, we did a lot of work with the National Farmers Union around hair coursing and the implications of what it means to farmers and the damage it causes and the consequential damages of the kind of people that do this thing has, and the impact it has on the farming communities out in rural areas. So there's a huge piece of education within policing, but there's also a huge education of our communities full stop, to make them understand what's endangered, what isn't, what law is out there to protect them, and to get behind policing. Let's be honest about it. If you were to ask someone, would you like policing to do this, which will stop your house being burgled, or would you like some officers to go out and spend some time stopping swans being shot at? Although they might feel quite passionately about both, at the end of the day, the instinctive thing is to want to protect their own area. So I think it's about using resources responsibly, making sure that public are properly aware of what issues are at stake here and where it affects their own communities, and then allowing police officers the resources to be able to police effectively, either independently or with the partners that we've talked about, to have a campaign of activity, for instance, against a particular crime area.
Yeah, okay, Joel, I'm going to come to you with the next question, because you've actually touched on it there, Georgie, because Mark Rowe, who's a former panelist and a high-profile journalist here in the security sector, says law enforcement has to be about priorities, Georgie. Should crimes against people be a higher priority? I mean, and I guess behind that is this, where should this sit? animals compared to humans. I'm going to come to all three of you on this. I think it's a really big emotional issue, but it's got real implications, isn't it? Because if we're going to get it on a priority list, we've got to manage this question. Georgie?
I think it's a balance. You know, if you were to ask me personally, is it my husband or the dog? I know who wins every time. We are very passionate about our animals, and we should be passionate about our environment and the animals that live in it. I completely understand, you know, where your question is coming from, because of course, you know, priority has to come. If individuals need our assistance and it's an emergency, if you have to run one way or the other, then of course you're going to always put the humans first. But that's not to say that we disregard and forget that resources are required to protect our wildlife. And I think if you were to generally ask 100 members of the public, you would be surprised how many feel very strongly that we don't give enough time and resources to looking after our wildlife, and the inevitable impact, as we've all touched on already, that does have with our wider community. You know, it does affect the farmers, it does affect businesses in different ways.
Yeah, okay. I mean, let me come to you though, Will. Specifically, Will, on this issue. I mean, I'll bring you in on this as well. Will, first, on this issue, Will, about what's the messaging, what's the selling point to get animals, just for a minute, or wildlife on the agenda when we haven't got enough resources to protect people? I'm just wondering what the dialogue says, what the messaging says. Will first, then Melanie. Will.
Well, and this gets to George's point about the balancing act. I think it depends in terms of how you define the problem, right? Because if you're looking at crimes against wildlife or crimes against the environment, if it's crimes against the environment, it's a far more broader argument, right? And the reality is you have to emphasize and highlight the impact that certain types of criminal activity or harmful activity has on individuals as well. And we have to emphasize and highlight kind of how crimes against the environment or harms against the environment can also have a negative impact on individuals or communities. So for example, I'll just give you an idea. So again, I've done some work in protected areas, and one of the biggest concerns is human-wildlife conflict, right? Not just this idea of whether or
what's
not—
a protected area? Can you just let people know? Just for the
Sure.
avoid—
So I've done work in Queen Elizabeth National Park. I've done work in Buindi, Chitwan National Park in Nepal. But one of the main kind of concerns that kind of arises is not just this idea of protecting animals from people who surround kind of these protected areas, but also protecting animals, protecting those people from the animals from these protected areas, right? So one of the biggest concerns is convincing people to protect wildlife when they themselves are losing livestock or crops or lives because of it. And so again, emphasizing and educating individuals, not only in terms of potential harmful impacts of wildlife as well, is important in terms of identifying alternatives to prevention, right? Because if you can develop prevention strategies that also protect humans from potential threats against them, while also having those mechanisms protect the wildlife themselves, that can bode well in terms of not only understanding the connectivity when it comes to crimes against the environment, but this idea of vested interest and buy-in from local community members. So I think there has to be, again, just more education, but also drawing it back to this idea of how it actually benefits individuals themselves.
Okay, really, really good. Mary, your take on this. I mean, as an animal victimologist, and this is a key question, isn't it, about how you get that victimization up on the agenda. Melanie?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to answer the question a little more broadly and then finish with the issue around victimology, I think there's sort of three key concerns around where do animals sit on this sort of set of priorities. Well, where do the crimes we're talking about, the behaviours we're talking about today, sit on those priorities rather than necessarily starting with animals? I think first of all there's the issue that a number of these offences also have direct impacts on humans, as has been touched upon already. So that includes things like loss of income. It includes impacts upon sustainable business practices and sustainable development. It includes the potential introduction of zoonoses through illicit wildlife trade, etc., all of which directly, as we've seen, impact quite significantly upon humans. So there are human impacts and concerns of these crimes anyway. So I think there's that side of it. The second is some of these offences also, as Will's already said, fit quite clearly into this idea of kind of environmental crimes. So then there's the environmental impacts. And we know that one of the biggest problems that's facing humanity today is environmental and climate change. You can't get much more serious of a thing to have to tackle than that. And some of these offences sit within that and have impacts on that. For example, we know when elephants are poached, it has significant impacts upon the local environment, which can lead to things like flooding, etc., post-drought and things like that. As I've seen in some of the questions as well, that from my perspective, I try to approach this from an anti-speciesist perspective. I also think we need to recognise that one of the things we should be doing is trying to protect the most vulnerable. And because of that lack of voice, the lack of recognition as victimisation, the lack of the ability to take somebody to court, animals are indeed the most vulnerable. They're more vulnerable than we are. I can stand here and I can demand my rights and I can demand to be protected, and animals can't do that. So for that reason, I would say the priority needs to significantly increase. So looking at that from just a slightly different perspective, as you said, I've been doing quite a lot of work recently in non-human animal victimology. So one of the things that I've really been sort of advocating for and looking into is the idea of actually recognising, not necessarily legally, but recognising a role within the criminal justice system for animals as victims. So in most legal jurisdictions, animals are considered property. They're not considered victims, even when they are the direct, those who experience the direct harm of either criminal activity or other types of social harm that might not be criminalised. And I think that needs to change. I think we need to recognise that actually many of these things directly victimise animals. And I'm not just talking about wildlife. I know, again, there's been mention about where do we distinguish wildlife. It's beyond the scope of what we can talk about today, but it's hugely problematic even just categorising animals into wildlife, domestic, farmed, etc. It raises a whole number of issues that as an anti-speciesist I have real sort of concerns and worries about. But that all animals need to be recognised where they have experienced harm, particularly criminalised harm, although I would go further, as victims, and there should be some way that we can consider them in court. So we see, for example, animal advocates being used in courts in limited jurisdictions to actually speak on behalf of animals who've suffered as a result of crime. I would like to see us introduce things such as the equivalent of victim impact statements, where somebody perhaps from the RSPCA or World Wildlife Fund or something speaks on behalf of an animal in court and explains the kind of suffering that that animal or that species may have experienced as a result of this. I'd like to see that kind of stuff. And I'd also like courts to think about how they could be much more creative in the use of things like compensation. So we would normally see in the UK, for example, if somebody was a victim of crime, one of the parts of the sentence would likely be compensation paid to that victim. We don't do that for animals because animals aren't recognised as victims and they don't have bank accounts that we can put compensation in. But what we can do is things like paying for kennelling costs. We can pay towards veterinary fees. We could pay towards therapy for animals who've been harmed in animal cruelty cases, for example. And I think we can be much, much more creative in how we view animals in a very different way to how we do at the moment.
I'll tell you what, man, none of that did I know. Really interesting thoughts. I wonder whether I come to you next, Will. One of the things you've all touched on, and you were just mentioning before we started the webinar, about the work you're doing about with groups that are involved in prevention, and about this whole study to understand that approach more. I wonder whether you could just give us an insight here. I mean, is it also another male-dominated world? Is it also a world which appeals to the macho rather than the, as the security world is known to be? Some would say falsely and changing, but still, it's got that image. Is there any sort of lessons the broader crime prevention world can learn from what's happening in this specialist area, or are things just the same?
I mean, there's a lot of similarities as it relates to when you look at typical law enforcement or security. We did a study, I did a study with the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, looking at just the range of profession globally. And in general, you're looking, the profession itself is predominantly male. 80% of the profession is male, 20% is female, based on the responses that we received. In some locations, in some countries, women are not even allowed to be conservation rangers by virtue of law. Moreover, there's some challenges related to promotion as it relates to gender. Moreover, the work itself, right? So, for example, if there's parental leave, whatever it might be, that actually can impact the way an individual can actually engage in the work itself. In some cases, women who've started families are often, for lack of a better phrase, are benched, right? Like they're put on desk jobs, and that's it. Like that's the way it is, which is fairly problematic. And so Moreover, there's some challenges related to kind of the provisions and kind of the resources provided for men and women in the profession itself, and that's distinctly that might be different as well. And so,
well, it sounds terrible.
I mean, it's like a lot of other professions, right? It's increasingly there's a lot of recognition about these differences, a lot of changes and differences. Moreover, there's recognition in terms of other really important topics like harassment, whether it be physical, sexual, etc., and discriminatory practices. And so I think that in general, there's more attention being paid to it, and as a result of that, there's going to be more insight, kind of hopefully deriving from that. But again, I think that when it comes to just simply looking at from a very broad, like here's how we enforce, here's how we kind of respond, and if you don't understand kind of again these human dimensions, we tend to lose a lot of information. We tend to lose a lot of nuance, and also we tend to lose a lot of benefits as well too. And now, whether it's right or wrong, there's a lot of these kind of preconceived notions that certain individuals have are better suited for certain types of the profession, right? Like no matter in most cases, if I'm talking to conservation rangers from around the world, there tends to be a perception that female rangers are better engaging with the community, like they're better in terms of education, communication, and et cetera. Not to say that they're not able to patrol or work in the field, but there tends to be this assumption that women are just simply better with the community. Now, whether or not that's true, and whether or not that's true in certain communities, if that's a component that can be seen as a benefit, that should be leveraged in a certain way, right? But at the same time, again, more nuance needs to be understood in terms of whether or not that actually is true or not, or whether or not that is discriminatory in its own right or biased in its own right. But I think that just, again, better understanding some of these nuances is very important to better understand kind of how initiatives are actually implemented and done. Moreover, how they're actually being interpreted or understood by the local communities that people might be engaged with.
Yeah, goodness me. I mean, George, you tell me it's not quite as dramatic as that in the UK. I mean, policing in the UK, by the way, is in the spotlight at the moment for some of these issues, I might add. But Georgie, you've already pointed out that this is a very narrow, small area. In fact, it's smaller than it was, and it doesn't seem to be going up. Tricky, right? Do you recognize some of those points about the way policing in its broader terms takes place in the circles that you're aware of?
In danger of going into another non-wildlife conversation, but yeah, I mean, there's always the challenges, isn't there, on gender-based issues at work. But I would say generally no. Certainly my experiences in the Met Police have been slightly different. I'd like to think we've been quite cutting edge in terms of the way we use gender and race in engaging with communities and using individuals, particularly enforcement individuals, to the benefit of dealing with crime and crime prevention. I think back to wildlife issues, I think one of the things that certainly based in London and was quite an eye-opener for me was the cultural differences. And that's something that we need to educate, not just officers, but also communities around, is that sometimes we are, particularly in very, very large multicultural communities, there is a very different approach to what wildlife means and what's acceptable and what isn't. And there's a lot of grey area. I remember distinctively going to a meeting and there'd been a spate of swans being killed. Well, ask most people who are aware that they know that they're protected animals, but there was obviously in a particular area a lack of understanding that these swans were protected. And I think it comes back to the conversation that we had at the beginning, this is all about education right at the beginning of schooling, all the way through, highlighting through social media in the same way that we've tried to raise the impression of how we cope with global warming and that sort of thing, pushing it out. I think we need to educate our communities around what specifically may be affecting their areas and the wider impact of that across, for instance, the UK. So, what happens if we allow people to come over and hair course? What does that in reality mean for a farming community? And what other crime does it bring with it? Because I think it's interesting. When I was working nationally, we had a specialist serious organised crime group that would come together, and all sorts of really interesting individuals that would sit on it. You'd have somebody who would deal with metal theft and heritage crime. There's another whole subject for you to discuss. And there was a representative from the wildlife crime unit. And the links that had to some very serious organised crime. These are individuals that have got their hands in this particular crime, but are distinctively linked to other serious crime. You know, leap of faith. But one of the things that we do know, for instance, is that people that abuse animals tend to abuse human beings as well. And there is that connectivity in the same way that you've got people who abuse and attack wildlife or exploit it for their own benefit will be involved in other serious crime.
Yeah, I mean, do you know, it's a really good point, isn't it? I mean, about the consequences of all this and speaking to people in terms that they can begin to understand the broader dynamics. And the more we turn this in, we get that language on the agenda. I haven't seen much of that, I've got to say, but I'm looking at it as an outsider. I haven't seen much of that. Let me come to, I've got a question here about vulnerability, but let me go to Piers Björn and Aliette Nkango. So I hope I pronounce your names correctly. I'm never very good at this on these webinars. Though no one's complained, but that's because they're nice people, I assume. Melanie, this vulnerability issue, this issue is a good one. Is wildlife crime and domestic animals, right? I mean, in your world, I'm sure they're all animals and they're equally as bad. Are they seen as equally as bad? And is one group more vulnerable than the other? Is it reasonable to put animal crime in one bundle and get people thinking about it, or is that messaging not overly helpful? Melanie first, then Will, who worked around this area too.
I'm going to answer this from my perspective because you told me I was allowed to be controversial and say what I thought. And so I'm not sure that this is necessarily how this will actually work best. But from my perspective, no, I think it's very unhelpful that we label animals as property, entertainment, food, pets, and then think that we put them in that box and there are things we're allowed to do to them and things we're not allowed to do to them. We know that probably we would think the most vulnerable animals are actually pet animals in terms of experiencing animal cruelty offences. They're very vulnerable in the home, etc. So that's kind of what we would probably first think of as being the most vulnerable. But actually, the most vulnerable animals are clearly farmed animals because their entire existence is built upon, predicated upon the, you know, the fact that we're going to treat them in the way that we do and then consume them at the end of it. So it would depend, obviously, how people sort of perceive those harms. And I suspect that Piers will be knowing his work, would sit very comfortably with my perspective on it around that, taking that sort of anti-speciesist approach. And actually, I don't think that's helpful at all to do that. But with regards to the broader topic and what is helpful in terms of actually pushing forward the idea of seeing all animals as potential victims of harms, as has been mentioned, it's education, it's changing perspective on how we view animals within society more broadly. And I think that starts in schooling and education. For example, in the UK, we have PSHCE, personal social health and citizenship education, which is sort of a perfect place where you could be starting to do some of that. It's the disconnect with nature and that sort of lack of kind of understanding of the importance of nature and that connection that we perhaps don't have with it anymore, particularly for people living in urban areas who might be kicking hedgehogs in the park and that kind of thing. And I think we need to see big policy change because that will kind of put that on the agenda. I'm not hopeful that will happen, but we need to kind of see a change in policy to take this type of crime and these sorts of harms more seriously.
Interesting. Will, let me come to you. Do you agree with Melanie? I mean, do you see it as unhelpful to put this all together? At this point, I hadn't really thought this through. I mean, farm animals are going to be killed. I mean, I've got to say I'm a vegetarian, by the way, which is a good thing to say at this moment. But you know, you see animals as being killed. So already there's an awareness these things happen and it's okay in certain circumstances to do that, to kill for food, for example. That doesn't help the image. This vulnerability bit, from your point of view, and wildlife and domestic and presenting them as a whole or separate. What's your view, Will?
I agree, actually. I don't think it's very helpful at all in the sense of the actual impact of any type of activity or harm or crime, at least from that standpoint. I really don't think it's helpful. In terms of political messaging, I could see why. I could see why it's separate, right? Because you're more likely going to be doing fundraising events for certain types of megafauna, particularly charismatic megafauna. And then you're also going to have a realm where you're going to be able to do some fundraising or advocacy for certain types of domesticated pets, canines, etc. So in terms of the messaging, educational, and branding, right, for better or for worse, it makes sense to separate. Now, in terms of the actual harm or act itself, no, it's not, because it's frankly, it is what it is. But in terms of again, context does also matter in this case, because certain types of pet species or species that are considered to be pets may be appropriate in one context and may be abhorrent in another. And right, so understanding kind of how that. I think the labeling of it is important, not only from a legalistic standpoint or definitional, but also from a cultural standpoint as well, because that's going to impact both components as well. And so, yeah, I think that there's a place for it, but in terms of fully understanding the bare bones, like, is this going to be useful? Not really. But I can see why it does exist for sure.
Yeah, and I guess, and presumably, Will, the attitude towards this must vary considerably around the world. I mean, I'm assuming my instinct would have been there must be a world view on how outrageous this is, and we could play to that. But I'm beginning to feel that I've simplified this beyond belief, really. Presumably, there are vast differences, are there, in how this is all perceived?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in general, like, certain species are viewed in a certain way in certain contexts. So for example, when I was doing some work and some field work in Nepal, they tend to patrol the protected areas on elephant back, right? That's kind of the traditional way of doing things and whatever it might be. However, when I've spoken to other rangers from other protected areas, they're like, that is absolutely terrible, because like they shouldn't be riding elephants, right? But given the terrain, given the culture, it was appropriate for what was happening in certain protected areas. Now, there was always a response to it too. Like, this is the way we've done things, and they might be revisiting certain things, but understanding how things play out again at a local level is really important. Because again, it's better to understand how that plays out in terms of how you define certain problems, but then also how it can be communicated in certain ways as well too, right? So yeah, it's similar to this idea of doing a broad-based, like, global response. That's the reason why it's problematic, because it's not defined, understood, or appreciated the same way in all levels, in all contexts.
Do you know, in that there we have it. There's me thinking I could simplify this in one magical way. Right, talking a magical way, I'm going to give you all this final question, and I'll come to you first, Georgie. A magic wand where you have one wish to the single big strategic type of approach that you think is going to be most helpful in beginning to either to change attitudes or tackle some part of problem. So if you could do one big strategic thing, what would you look to do? Georgie, you first.
I think it's respect. I think it begins for me with education at ground roots and treating respect for each other. So that's the human element, for our planet and for our animals, whether they're wild or domestic. I think we just need to be more caring and more respectful, and if we can start at the very beginning with that and work our way up and then slot in the legislation that would support that, that would be amazing. That's what my magic wand would do.
Yeah, okay, makes sense. Will, your magic wand, what are you going to do?
I would wish for a multifaceted educational approach that was based on communication, that was appropriately contextualized. And so what we know from not only just from research is that if you approach certain segments of society delivering certain communication or educational messages, you get to target and maximize that approach. For example, what we know is that parents can have their behaviors change simply because they learn from their kids, right? And so one of the most effective ways to actually develop, for example, pro-conservation initiatives is to educate the kids, who then can educate their parents. And so identifying various ways to deliver and communicate information in a manner that is appropriate for certain segments of society, I think, is one of the best ways to go, because ultimately, as we mentioned before, it's very difficult to prevent things when you're not around, and law enforcement's not always all around. So.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, Melanie, just 20 seconds, you wouldn't mind, we're running out of time. Your magic wand, how are you going to use it?
gather together and share best practice. And then if I can just add on in my final few seconds, also recognise animals as victims who ought to be legally be legal holders of rights.
Yeah, I do like that. I do like that. Listen, thank you so much. That was a fascinating conversation. I have to say, all three of you taught me for sure. And we didn't get through all the questions. I'm sorry, I had more coming through, but an absolutely fascinating conversation. And I'm sure we'll come back to it. So thank you all of that. So a few final comments from me, if I might. Just to say very, very quickly that the OSPAs are open in the following countries: Romania, the United States, and the TAC Economic Crime Awards. They're closing soon, though, in Romania, so do get onto it. In fact, they close today, in fact, so get onto it today. And we've got up-and-coming events, the awards. 26th of May, we're going to be in Ireland for the Irish OSPAs. On the 7th of June in South Africa, and on the 8th of June in Bucharest, Romania, for the OSPAs there. Also to say, next week we're at IFSEC, so do come and say hello to us. We'll be on stand 4844, IF 4844. So do come and say hello to me and Christine. We look forward to seeing you there. And more thought leadership webinars coming up. As you know, we have these every 2 weeks now. Security threats in smart cities, pride in the security sector, what next for the LGBT community, and healthcare fraud. They're all on the agenda, so look out for those. Thanks once again to the panelists for their educational insights. Really appreciate those. Thank you, the audience, for your questions, and sorry we didn't get to everyone. Thanks to Shrey Singh in the background. And as always, look forward to seeing you soon. Until we meet again, wherever you are in the world, stay safe. Take care.
Thank you.